Snow drifted down in heavy silence, veiling the town in white, softening the edges of roofs, railings, and boots that shuffled restlessly across the packed square. The lantern above the auction block swung in the bitter wind, its flame a wavering, fragile thing against the winter night. Naomi Hargrove stood there with her shoulders drawn tight, shawl clutched around her frame, every breath rising like smoke into the frozen air. Her height made her impossible to miss, her curves pronounced beneath the faded dress her father had pressed into her hands before pushing her forward. She had known shame before, but never under such a cruel spotlight. The auctioneer, Ezekiel Crowder, had a voice like rusted iron. He banged his cane on the wooden planks, his laughter sharp, cutting through the snowfall. Here she is, folks. Strong as an ox, broad as a barn wall. Big girl like this ought to fetch a decent price, if any man's got the spine to handle her. His words drew a ripple of laughter, low and mean, rolling across the gathered townsfolk. Naomi felt the heat rise up her neck even in the cold. She lowered her gaze, wishing she could sink into the snow and vanish. A man in the front, Jonas Pike, spat into the drift by his boots. His face wore the easy cruelty of one who delighted in spectacle. "I'll give you a coin," he sneered, flipping a silver piece into the air and catching it with practiced contempt. "Not for her worth, just to see her carted off. Too big for a man's bed anyhow." The crowd chuckled, the sound muffled by scarves and mittens, yet sharp enough to sting like barbs. Naomi's chest tightened. She pressed her lips together until they ached, but no strength of will could keep her eyes from watering. Snowflakes clung to her hair, melting on the heat of her shame. She remembered the hushed conversations behind doors, the whispers that said she was unwanted, a burden, unfit for marriage. Each murmur had carved itself into her ribs, and now, here in the open square, the wounds were exposed for all to prod. She fought the tremor in her hands, the urge to cover her ears, to run, but her father had already stepped back, his face turned away. She was alone. Crowder rapped his cane again. "Come now, who'll make a real offer?" Sturdy arms, wide hips, could cook and clean twice over. "Any takers?" The silence that followed was worse than laughter, like the whole town had agreed she was less than nothing. Naomi's breath faltered, her shawl slipping a little, and for a heartbeat she thought she might collapse. Then the crowd stirred. Not with laughter, nor with scorn, but with a sudden, startled hush. The silence broke like glass when the snow behind the square shifted, and a figure emerged from the whiteness. He was immense, towering over the gathered settlers, bare-chested despite the storm, his skin bronze against the white world, his long hair pale as frost. Braids woven with bone beads swung across his shoulders, and the wind carried the sound of them clicking softly together. His steps were unhurried, steady, each one crushing the snow with a weight that seemed older than the town itself. Naomi's breath caught. She had seen Apache men before, but never one like him. There was no youth in his face, his 60 years were etched deep, but they had carved strength rather than weakness. His white hair glowed against the storm, his chest rose and fell with the calm of a man untouched by ridicule. He did not look at the crowd, nor at the auctioneer. His eyes, dark and quiet as embers, fixed only on her. The settlers shifted uneasily, their whispers sharp with fear and awe. Some muttered "White Hawk" under their breath. Others dared not speak at all. Crowder bristled, cane tapping nervously. "Now see here, Chayton," he said, his bluster thin as paper. "This here's a sale, not some spectacle." But the Apache giant did not pause for permission. He stepped up onto the platform, the wood creaking under his weight. Snow whirled around his shoulders as he came to stand before Naomi. For the first time all night, she lifted her head. Their eyes met, hers swimming with humiliation, his steady, implacable. Without a word, he bent and swept her into his arms. The crowd gasped, voices breaking through the hush in a chorus of disbelief. Naomi's body stiffened, but the strength in his hold was not crushing. It was sure, balanced, as though she had always been meant to rest there. The auctioneer sputtered. You can't just take her." Chayton Whitehawk's voice rolled low, deep as the storm itself. He spoke slowly, each word heavy with finality. "You sold her for being too big." His gaze swept over the crowd, quiet fire in his eyes. Then he looked down at Naomi, held as if she weighed less than the snowfall itself. His lips curved, not in a smile, but in a truth carried on the breath of winter. "She is just right for my arms." The murmurs faltered, as if the snow itself had hushed them. Naomi's heart thundered against her ribs, every nerve alive with shock. Her shame still burned, but something else flared within it. An ember of recognition, of dignity not yet claimed but suddenly offered. The lantern swung overhead, flame flickering, as the giant Apache carried her down from the stage. The crowd parted, silent, uncertain, their judgment frozen on their tongues. Snow closed around them, erasing footprints as quickly as they were made, as though the world itself conspired to hide this moment away. Naomi clutched the edge of his braid with trembling fingers, not out of fear, but out of disbelief that someone had chosen her. Not as ridicule, not as burden, but as belonging. She did not know his name, nor what fate awaited beyond the storm. Yet as the square and its whispers blurred into white, she knew she had crossed the threshold of her life, and nothing would be the same again. For in the arms of the man the town feared, she felt, for the first time, the faint and dangerous possibility of being seen as enough. Snow whirled around them as Chayton carried Naomi from the square, his long strides unhurried, steady as if the storm itself bent to his pace. She clung to the weight of her shawl, heart hammering, still dazed by the crowd's laughter and his sudden defiance of it. The murmurs faded behind them until only the wind remained, brushing the pines and sweeping the night with a howl that seemed to speak of things older than towns and auctions. His chest was warm against her, the rise and fall of his breath steady, grounding. She had never been held like that, without mockery, without hesitation, just held. The cabin came into view through the storm, a squat figure of logs crouched among the trees, its roof thick with snow. Smoke lifted faintly from the chimney, blurred by the gale. He pushed open the heavy door with his shoulder, and stepped into dim light. A fire glowed low in the hearth, shadows climbing the walls. He set her gently down on a buffalo robe stretched before the flames, and for the first time since leaving the square, Naomi found her voice. "You shouldn't have done that," she whispered, the words breaking with the residue of shame. Her hands fumbled with the edge of her shawl. "They'll come for me. They'll say—" She could not finish.
Chayton crouched by the hearth, feeding it dry kindling until the flames leapt higher, sending a wash of warmth across the room. His back was broad, the white of his hair catching the firelight, gleaming like snow beneath sunlight. He did not answer at once, and his silence unsettled her more than cruelty ever had. Finally, he spoke, his voice low, measured, each word carrying the weight of stone rolled into place. "They already said enough. The storm will cover their voices." Naomi's throat tightened. She looked around the cabin, simple, spare, yet cared for. A table with a carved bowl, a deerskin stretched to dry, a woven blanket folded neatly in the corner. No mockery lived in these walls. She wrapped her arms around herself and wondered what kind of man chose silence over insult, fire over ridicule. He poured water into a small iron pot, hung it over the flame, and added dried leaves with careful hands. The scent of pine and sage began to rise, mingling with the smoke. He brought a cup to her, steam curling like breath in the cold. She hesitated, then took it, the warmth seeping into her chilled fingers. When she sipped, the bitter, earthy taste grounded her, anchoring her body to the moment. "You carry shame that is not yours," he said quietly, watching the fire. Her head snapped up. No one had ever named it so plainly. She set the cup down, trembling. "What else am I supposed to carry? My father told me no man would ever want me. The town reminded me every chance it had. Tonight only proved them right." Her voice broke, and she pressed her hand over her mouth, wishing she had stayed silent. Chayton's gaze lifted, dark and steady, and for a long moment the crackle of the fire filled the space between them. Then he spoke, his words like the slow current of a deep river. "The snow bends trees, but does not break them. You bend, but you are not broken." Naomi's breath caught. Something in his tone, neither pity nor flattery, but certainty, slipped past her defenses. She stared at him, at the lines carved into his weathered face, at the strength that did not need to prove itself by laughter or cruelty. He was older, years upon years beyond her, and yet his presence steadied her in a way no man her age ever had. She wiped at her eyes with the back of her hand, embarrassed by her tears. "Why would you bother with me? You could have let them laugh and gone on your way." His lips pressed together, the faintest shadow of a smile ghosting at the corners. "Because I do not measure a woman by the smallness of men's eyes." The words fell into her chest like embers, glowing quietly, refusing to die out. She looked down, her cheeks warming with something new, something fragile that unsettled her more than the storm. Time slowed in the cabin. She helped him peel potatoes from a sack, her hands brushing against his once, a flicker that made her pulse quicken. He repaired a torn seam in his coat, and she marveled at the steadiness of his large fingers guiding a needle. Their silence was not empty. It grew thick with unspoken understanding, with the quiet building of trust. Later, she rose to spread her damp shawl near the fire. He stepped closer, lifting the heavy fabric from her hands and hanging it carefully on a peg by the hearth. His nearness startled her, the sheer breadth of him, the warmth radiating from his bare skin. She looked up, and for a heartbeat their eyes locked. Hers shone with a mix of fear and longing she could not hide. His held only patience, as if he would wait through every storm the world had to offer. She turned away quickly, cheeks burning, her heart racing in the quiet. Yet even as she sat again on the buffalo robe, she felt the echo of his gaze lingering, not consuming her, but steadying her, as though he meant every word he had spoken. The storm howled harder outside, rattling the shutters, piling drifts against the walls. She lay down near the fire, exhaustion overtaking her, and listened to him move about the cabin, his steps measured, his presence filling the space with safety. She closed her eyes, and for the first time in years, sleep came without dread. When she stirred near dawn, the fire still glowed, and Chayton was seated cross-legged near the door, awake, watching the snow through the small window. He had not slept. He turned his head slightly as her eyes opened, his expression unreadable, yet his presence a shield. Naomi sat up slowly, her shawl slipping from her shoulders. The shame from the auction clung still, but it was softer now, tempered by the memory of his words. She studied him in the fragile light, wondering what kind of man chose to guard her through the night, what kind of strength lived in silence rather than scorn. Before she could ask, he spoke again, quiet as a vow. "The storm will end, but their eyes will not change. You must decide whose voice you will carry, theirs or your own." Her breath faltered. The question lodged deep, heavier than any insult she had borne. She turned back to the fire, its glow reflecting in her eyes, uncertain yet drawn to the edge of something she had never dared before. The thought that she might be more than what the town had named her. The storm outside pressed harder against the cabin walls, as though testing their resolve. She pulled the buffalo robe around her and sat close to the flames, the weight of his words settling in her chest. Somewhere in the distance, a sound rose, a faint, sharp knock carried on the wind, or perhaps only the groan of ice. But Naomi's heart leapt, for it felt like the world itself was reminding her the storm was only the beginning. By the time the storm eased, the town's gossip had already outpaced the thaw. Whispers carried faster than the wind, curling into every corner of the settlement like smoke that refused to disperse. Naomi felt at the moment she stepped into the trading post, the way conversations cut short, the way eyes slid over her with something between pity and scorn. Isabella Bell's voice floated above the muttering, pitched just loud enough for all to hear. Too big for any decent man, unless he's a savage who doesn't know better. The words struck like stones, and Naomi's hands tightened on the basket she carried, knuckles blanching. She kept her head bowed as she collected flour and lard, pretending the voices did not reach her, though each one carved a deeper groove in her chest. Behind her, a man chuckled, a low sneer masked as amusement. Carried off by that old Apache. Must be desperate, both of them. Laughter followed, muffled but sharp. Naomi forced herself to walk out without a word, snow crunching beneath her boots as if to drown the sound of their derision. Back at the cabin, the forest offered no such judgment. Pine stood sentinel, branches heavy with white, the air crisp and clean. Chayton split logs by the chopping block, his axe rising and falling with steady rhythm. Each strike rang clear, uncomplicated, unlike the murmur of the town. Naomi lingered at the edge of the clearing, watching the snow plume with each blow. There was a grace in his movements, an economy born of years, his body unbothered by the weight of the work. She envied it, the way he seemed untouched by whispers.
When he noticed her, he paused, setting the axe upright in the block. His gaze met hers across the distance, and though he said nothing, she felt seen in a way that steadied her. She carried the provisions inside, where the fire still burned low. As she kneaded dough for bread, her mind wrestled with the voices she could not silence. Every stretch of the dough felt like stretching her own strength thin, yet she pressed harder, determined to make something rise where only emptiness had been. Days folded into one another, quiet and deliberate. Naomi mended clothes by the fire, her stitches small and careful. Chayton repaired tools, sanded wood, strung snares for rabbits. Their words were few, but their gestures began to fill the silence with a language all its own. When she left food by his seat, he met her eyes and gave a slow nod, the kind of acknowledgement that weighed more than praise. When he sharpened her scissors and set them back without a word, she touched the blades and felt the subtle respect hidden in the act. Yet the gossip reached even into the forest. A trapper who stopped by with pelts let slip his smirk. "Town says you found your match at last, Naomi. Found someone big enough to hide behind." He laughed as though it were harmless, but the words stung until her face burned. After he left, she sat by the hearth, hands clenched tight in her lap. Chayton returned with firewood and found her stiff, her eyes glossy with unshed tears. "They will not stop," he said simply, placing the wood by the fire. His voice carried no surprise, only truth. "They fear what they do not understand." Naomi's breath trembled. "And what am I then? Something for them to fear? Or something for them to laugh at until I can't hold my head up anymore?" Chayton settled across from her, the firelight dancing across the planes of his face. His silence stretched long, but it was not neglect, it was weight gathering. At last he spoke. "You are not their measure. You are your own." Her throat tightened. No one had ever given her such a thought, as though her worth might exist outside the eyes of others. She turned from him quickly, blinking hard, unwilling to let him see how deeply it cut her. That night, she woke to find the bed of furs cold where he should have been. Rising quietly, she followed the faint sound of chanting outside. The snow glowed blue beneath the moon, and there he stood, bare chest rising and falling in rhythm with his voice, deep and resonant, carrying into the sky. His breath plumed like smoke, his hair ghostly in the night. She watched, transfixed, as though the earth itself leaned in to listen. Something in her shifted as she realized he, too, bore the weight of judgment, the town's suspicion, the settler's fear. Yet he did not bow beneath it. He stood tall, spoke his language into the night, refusing to let silence erase him. They were mirrors of exile, each carrying wounds from voices meant to diminish. The knowledge struck her like a quiet revelation. Shame had bound them both, but it could also be the tether that drew them closer. The following day, when he returned from hunting, snow dusted across his shoulders, she reached out instinctively. With trembling fingers, she brushed the flakes away. The gesture was small, barely more than a touch, but it carried the weight of all she had not spoken. He paused, looking down at her hand against his skin, then met her gaze. His eyes held neither question nor claim, only recognition. In that moment, the silence between them hummed with something fragile, a connection rooted in quiet grace. The days that followed deepened the rhythm. Naomi laughed once at a clumsy rabbit slipping on ice, and Chayton's mouth curved, not into laughter but into a softened stillness that felt like a smile. She found herself humming while she worked, and the sound did not jar against the air. The gossip still circled in her memory, sharp as ever, but its grip loosened when she remembered his words. She was not their measure. Still, fear lingered. Each trip into town was a trial, Every whisper a blade turned anew. The weight of gossip pressed down with each passing week, and Naomi knew it was only a matter of time before words turned to action. She felt it in the way men stared too long, in the way Isabella Bell's tone dripped venom when she said, "A woman who hides in the forest has something to hide." One evening, as snow fell softer, Chayton returned with a deer slung across his shoulders. Naomi lit the lantern to guide him to the door, her heart warming at the sight. But behind him, just beyond the tree line, she glimpsed a shadow move, then another. The hair at her neck rose. She stepped back, the lantern trembling in her grip. Chayton's eyes followed hers, narrowing. He set the deer down slowly, every motion deliberate, his body still but alert. The forest was silent save for the whisper of falling snow. Naomi's pulse quickened, the weight of gossip suddenly heavier, transformed into something more dangerous. What had begun as whispers in town had found its way into the woods, and she knew, with a chill that rivaled the storm, that judgment was coming for them in flesh and bone. The blizzard came down like a living thing, sweeping through the valley with a roar that rattled the shutters and buried the cabin in white. For 3 days, Naomi and Chayton were trapped together in the small room, where the fire never slept. Snow pressed heavy against the walls, and the wind screamed through the cracks like a chorus of ghosts. Naomi wrapped herself in the buffalo robe, staring at the flames until her vision blurred. Yet the storm outside was nothing compared to the storm she carried inside. Each blast of wind dredged up her past, the night her father told her she would never be chosen, the eyes of men who looked her over and dismissed her with smirks, the memory of being sold on the stage while laughter gnawed at her like teeth. Shame crawled through her bones with a bitterness deeper than cold. Chayton moved with quiet steadiness, stoking the fire, mending a broken snare, or tending to the pot simmering with thin broth. His presence was an anchor against the chaos of the storm. Naomi envied the way he seemed unshaken, as though the world outside could rage forever, and he would remain unchanged. She envied it until the envy cracked and turned to despair. One night, the storm howled loudest, and she could no longer keep her silence. "They're right," she whispered, her voice brittle. Chayton looked up from where he sat sharpening a knife, his eyes patient, waiting. Naomi's words shook as they came. "Too big, too much, too, everything. I hear them even here. I carry their voices like chains." Her hands twisted in the robe until her knuckles whitened. "Sometimes I think I'll drown in their laughter before I ever feel clean." Chayton set the blade aside and crossed the narrow space. He sat before her, his bulk blocking the firelight, his shadow falling over her like shelter. Slowly, he reached for her hands. His were enormous, scarred, rough with years of work, but when they closed over hers they were steady. He did not speak at once. He simply held her trembling fingers until her breath slowed. Then, softly, he said, "The snow buries all voices. Listen instead to the silence it leaves behind." Tears welled hot, spilling down her cheeks, and though she tried to turn away, he did not release her hands. His silence did not scorn, it steadied her. She felt the rhythm of his breathing, the weight of his gaze, and for the first time in years she did not feel alone in her shame. She let the tears fall, and he did not look away. When dawn finally broke after days of storm, the world outside was unrecognizable. Trees bowed beneath drifts, roofs sagged under weight, and the forest floor was a white ocean stretching without end. Naomi stepped outside, the cold air biting her skin, and felt as though she had walked into another world. The snow gleamed, untouched, dazzling beneath a fragile sun. She drew in a breath so sharp it hurt, and for the first time she wondered if storms might cleanse as much as they destroyed. But peace lasted only a moment. A crunch of boots carried over the snow, sharp against the hush. Chayton appeared at her side instantly, his body going still, his eyes narrowing. From the tree line came Ezekiel Crowder, his cane tapping against the frozen ground, flanked by 3 townsmen with rifles slung over their shoulders. Their coats were heavy, their faces red from the cold, but their eyes gleamed with purpose. Naomi's stomach twisted. The gossip had grown teeth. Crowder stopped a few paces away, sneer curling across his face. "Well, well. The giant's hut. We heard you'd hold up here, Naomi. Thought we'd come see what kind of disgrace you've wrapped yourself in." His gaze slid over her with cruel satisfaction. Too big for decent men, so you found yourself a savage who doesn't know the difference. Naomi's cheeks burned, her breath short. The voices of the town roared back in her head, every insult renewed. She wanted to shrink into the snow, to vanish before their eyes. But Chayton stepped forward, his body a wall of flesh and bone between her and their jeers. His silence was louder than their words. One of the men spat into the snow. She ought to come back with us. Ain't right, hiding out with him. Folks are talking. Say it's shameful. Shameful. The word echoed in Naomi's skull, clawing at the fragile piece she had begun to build. Her hands trembled, but she clenched them into fists, digging nails into her palms. Every part of her wanted to step back, to let Chayton shield her, but something in her refused to bow completely. She took one step forward, enough that she stood partly beside him, not only behind. Crowder's sneer deepened. Look at you. Pretending you belong. But you don't. You're a burden to him, same as you've always been to every man. The words cut deep, sharper than wind, but this time they did not land unchallenged. Naomi lifted her chin, though her voice faltered as she spoke. You don't decide where I belong. The sound was small, but it carried in the cold air, carried enough that Chayton's head turned toward her, his eyes sparking with quiet fire. Crowder laughed, but the sound felt hollow against the vast white silence. He gestured at his men, but none moved. The weight of the snow seemed to press upon them too, muffling their bravado. The forest stood still, waiting. Chayton's voice broke the hush, low and steady. Leave. It was not shouted, not barked, but spoken with such finality that even the wind seemed to pause. Crowder bristled, gripping his cane tighter, but the rifles did not rise. The men shifted uneasily, glancing between one another, uncertain. Naomi's pulse thundered in her ears. She had stepped forward, spoken once, but doubt still gnawed. Could she withstand more? Could she claim space in a world determined to shrink her? Crowder's sneer returned. This isn't finished, he hissed. He jabbed his cane into the snow and turned, his men following reluctantly. Their boots crunched as they vanished back into the trees, leaving only silence in their wake. Naomi let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Her knees weakened and she nearly sank into the drift, but Chayton's hand found hers, steadying her once more. She looked up at him, his white hair gleaming against the pale sun, his gaze fierce yet gentle. In that instant, something shifted in her. Not the erasure of shame, but the dawning possibility of standing tall despite it. Yet the quiet did not soothe her fully. She knew Crowder's words were not empty. Gossip had become confrontation, and confrontation would become something darker still. She could feel it, like thunder rolling beneath the snow. She clung to Chayton's hand, and as the cold wind cut across the clearing, she understood. The storm outside had ended, but a greater one was coming, and this time it would not be whether they had to survive. The days after Crowder's visit were heavy with silence, as if the snow itself held its breath. Naomi moved through the cabin with unease pressing against her ribs, each creak of the floorboards reminding her that gossip had grown into menace. She could not scrub the image of their rifles from her mind, nor the venom in Crowder's voice. At night, she woke to every sound of shifting ice, to every crack of the trees bowing under snow, half certain it was footsteps drawing near. Yet amid the dread, she found herself standing taller than she once had. Shame still tugged at her like a shadow, but she had begun to recognize its weight as something she could choose to set down. Chayton did not speak of Crowder, but she sensed the watchfulness in him sharpen. He checked the traps more often, lingered longer at the tree line, his eyes searching the white horizon. His quiet steadiness gave her strength, though she feared what silence could not stop. One evening, as she stirred stew over the fire, she spoke softly without turning. "They'll come back." It was not a question. He answered from the doorway, his voice low. "Yes." The word settled like a stone in her chest. She turned to him, her eyes wide. "What will you do?" He stepped inside, closing the door behind him, snow sliding from his shoulders. His gaze held hers with the unflinching patience she had come to know. "What I must." She wanted to ask if that meant violence, but the words would not come. She only nodded, and in the silence that followed, she felt both fear and certainty knot together inside her. It was dawn when the reckoning came. Naomi was grinding corn at the table when she heard the crunch of many boots outside, not muffled by caution, but heavy with intent. She froze, pestles slipping from her fingers. Chayton was already at the door, his body tense. Through the small window, Naomi saw them. Crowder with his cane, flanked by half a dozen men, rifles in hand, their faces drawn tight with the self-righteous cruelty of those convinced they held the right to judge. Chayton stepped out first, bare-chested in the cold as always, the snow swirling around his immense frame. Naomi's pulse thundered as she followed, shawl tight around her shoulders, though every instinct begged her to remain hidden. Crowder's sneer widened when he saw her. "There she is," he said, his voice cutting through the frozen air. "The shame of this town, parading herself as if she belongs. You've had your time, Naomi. Now you'll come back where you can't disgrace us further." The men muttered their agreement, rifles glinting with frost. Naomi's throat constricted, but she forced herself to lift her chin. She felt Chayton's presence beside her, solid as a mountain, his silence a shield. Yet she knew silence alone would not be enough this time. Crowder jabbed his cane into the snow. "And you," he spat at Chayton. "Savage thief. You've taken what was not yours to take. Do you think your size, your age, your barbaric pride will keep us from correcting this sin?" Naomi trembled, the old shame clawing its way back, threatening to bury her. She heard again the laughter from the auction, the whispers of, "Too big, too much," the sting of every dismissal. But then she felt the memory of Chayton's hand closing over hers in the storm, his words reminding her she was not broken. Something rose in her chest, fierce and unyielding. She stepped forward, placing herself half a pace ahead of him. Her voice shook but carried through the hush. "I do not belong to you. Not to your whispers, not to your cruelty, not to your laughter. You cannot sell me, and you cannot shame me into silence." The words startled even her, but once spoken they did not waver. She felt her spine straighten, her breath deepen, as though the very snow beneath her feet lent its strength. Chayton's gaze burned steady on her, pride and quiet fire in his eyes. Crowder barked a laugh, ugly and sharp. "Look at her. Pretending she's worth a man's claim. No man but a savage would touch her." He raised his cane as though to strike the ground again, but Chayton's voice cut through before the wood could fall. "She is mine," he said, his voice low, thunderous. The men stiffened, rifles wavering. He stepped forward, placing his hand gently but firmly over Naomi's, lifting it and pressing it to his chest. His words rolled slow, deliberate. "Not by coin. By choice. By arms that will not let her fall." The clearing went still. Snow drifted soundlessly between them. Naomi felt her heart hammer beneath her palm, the weight of his chest rising beneath her fingers, the truth of his vow reverberating through her bones. Crowder faltered, his sneer twitching as uncertainty cracked his bravado. The rifles dipped, the men glancing between one another. In the silence, Naomi lifted her chin higher, her voice steady now. "You called me too much. But here I am enough. More than enough." Her words struck like flint against stone, sparking something she had never claimed before, dignity that no gossip could strip away. For the first time, she looked directly into the eyes of those who had ridiculed her, and they did not hold power. Crowder's face flushed with rage, but the weight of the moment pressed against him as surely as the snow pressed against the trees. With a curse muttered under his breath, he turned sharply, his cane stabbing into the drift as he stalked away. The men followed, their bravado spent, their rifles lowered, their silence louder than any insult. Naomi's breath came fast, fogging in the cold, but her hands no longer shook. Chayton stood beside her, his arms steady at her back. She turned to him, her eyes bright with unshed tears, and whispered, "They'll come again." His gaze held hers, unwavering. "Then we will stand again." The snow fell gently now, softening the harsh lines left by boots and cane. Naomi felt the fire in her chest, fierce and alive, no longer hidden beneath shame. She had spoken, and the world had not ended. She had stood, and the earth had not given way. Instead, the storm inside her had broken, and what remained was strength she had never believed she carried. The cabin behind them glowed with firelight, its warmth a promise. The town had tried to strip her dignity, but here, in the arms of the man they feared, she had found it. The reckoning was not only with them, it was within herself, and she had claimed victory. Yet even as relief washed over her, a deeper truth pulsed in the silence that followed. The town had retreated, but its judgment had not vanished. The world beyond their clearing would always test the bond forged here. Naomi looked to Chayton, his white hair glinting against the dark sky, and knew their fight was not finished, it had only begun.